Okay, so we're now recording. I want to thank everybody for joining. As always, it's always fun for me to get together with all of you and talk about topics that are going on within our industry. And I really appreciate everybody being willing to share their time, their expertise, and their questions. And so it looks like Aaron has been delayed, but I want to go ahead and get started. Just to recap, there was some inquiries from various attendees around, what the interest might be in the topic of um, building trusted AI. So John Schmay asked about, authoring in a process that's surrounded by AI, and how do we, ensure trust in the content that's being created. Libby Healy had a great point about, in the old world, we used to link, for example, one document to one case from a KCS standpoint, and how does that change when we are perhaps generating knowledge based on information from multiple systems? Do we need to link to that generated answer, or do we forget about that concept? And so I want to share one thing really quick around the high level agenda that we have. But before I do that, I want to let Swami introduce himself. Swami and I have worked together in the past, and I think he's worked with many of you, but I appreciate him being here today to specifically share some of the experience that a company he founded has dealt with. So Swami, would you mind giving both a personal introduction as well as tell a little bit about the organization that you started and what you guys have been up to recently?
Absolutely. Thank you, Scott. And it's great to have this wonderful audience here. The questions are already pretty stimulating, and I'm going like, I haven't thought about these questions yet. As Scott said, I'm Swami Ganapathy. I come from a very technical background, was a software architect, and ran a lot of enterprise integration projects, especially in the contact center space, before starting this organization called SPAR Solutions. Our goal with starting SPAR Solutions was always to help business leaders basically grapple with technology, try to make it simpler for them to work with it. I mean, when we started, and this was more than 20 years ago, technology was very different, and we constantly had projects that had cost overruns, and never seemed to deliver the value that was expected of them, right? And we came into being wanting to solve that problem for business leaders. And I think while the technology has evolved and a lot has grown, and we've got this pretty amazing world of AI that's in front of us, I think the problems are continue to still be the same. So we're continuing to enjoy being on the journey. At SPAR Solutions, we're a partner with Salesforce. We partner with Verint Systems, the two of the leaders in the CRM space, as well as we're a partner with Azure and AWS. And so we end up implementing a lot of solutions in this area. With that, I'll pause and give control back to Scott here.
Awesome. Thanks, Swami. So just to sort of start off with the high level topics that I'd planned to have Aaron cover. Let me share my screen here really quick. So can everybody see this basic slide talking about where Sherlock Holmes was, where does he live?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So as those of you who have known me for a while already realize, I'm not a fancy PowerPoint person. I feel like fanciness too oftentimes takes the place for substance. So this is very basic, put together in about 3 minutes. But this is an example of the common types of data or information that is sent to these generative AI systems. So, in one hand, and I'm also a big fan of oversimplifying things, just talking about it from a layman's standpoint, even if, the technical accuracy isn't 100%. But the concept is that, we're sending this AI system a certain amount of information that it can, quote unquote, learn from, right? And so there's, some text out there that says, a little bit about Sherlock Holmes before mentioning him by name, and then, talks about where he lives and gives an address. But, from a highly oversimplified standpoint, the concept of synonyms here applies that we're all obviously very well aware of, where he hails from, is sort of the same thing as where does he live. Now, this is a very simple example, but you can imagine that a multitude of organizations would have similar challenges where maybe instead of personal names and addresses, you're dealing with social security numbers, financial data, et cetera. But really the only way for something like an LLM to answer the question of where does Sherlock Holmes live in the traditional sense is to know both the name Sherlock Holmes as well as that address of where he lives. And so the one thing that companies like Opaque are working on, and I'd be very curious to start off our conversation today to hear if you all have this interest within your organization, as well as if other solutions are out there, is what if we sent the same sort of knowledge and the same sort of question to the LLM, but instead of putting the PII or the financial information or the confidential intellectual property or whatever it may be, we sort of tokenize that. Because while this looks very odd to us, who the heck is person _1, from a computing standpoint, it really is no different than a name. It just sees, in the neural network, the associations there. And then more interestingly, in my opinion, is there's a lot of technologies out there that can just tokenize certain information. But one of the things that companies like Opaque are doing is they're actually encrypting that information so that it's never visible from a third-party data processor standpoint. But based on the learning of this information here in this first sentence, it can still answer the question, where does that person live? And then when this information comes back, you're simply decrypting the tokens there, and it essentially, on your side with your organization's trusted data network, encrypts that or detokenizes that back to the information that the user will understand. So I'll pause there. Aaron has since joined us, but Aaron, I was just kind of going over a super basic concept that I pulled from you guys' website.
You're nailing it. You're nailing it. I don't think I can just stay on mute.
Well, I used to be a salesperson, so I haven't lost all those skills. Maybe this is a good opportunity for you to introduce yourself and with that tee up.
Okay, one sec. Let me switch devices.
And so while Aaron's switching devices, does that make sense to everybody? Is that sort of a topic that your organization has been, talking about, is protecting, the type of data that you send to these third-party services?
I can jump in there and pretty much say that every client that we work with is definitely very concerned about this, right? I mean, I think they're already everyone knows that there's already a fair amount of leakage going on. There's a lot of free tools available, and you have no idea which employees are using what tools at this point. And while organizations have mandated that people don't use these tools, I think it's still fair to say that everyone's really worried about the fact that you could have employees interacting with these LLM tools, sharing data that's now getting saved outside of their network, outside of their control, and it's a huge risk that every organization is, while they're struggling to kind of take their baby steps moving into working with generative AI, that they already know that everyone's kind of behind the 8 ball here.
Yeah.
Well,
Aaron, I think you should be able to share your screen, no problem.
Oh, and I want to start off by saying I apologize to everybody on the call. I had a meeting with the New York Stock Exchange that ran way over, that I was not expecting to be running over quite so long. So I apologize for running late. It says
appreciate you.
Host disabled participant screen sharing.
Okay, let me make you a host to solve that problem. Sorry about that.
Okay.
While you're doing that, Scott, I just want to make a point that it works both ways. There's questions about trusting the data that comes back. We all know about hallucinations, but it's another standard concern. For example, I watched the Sherlock Holmes movie last night. I'm a big fan. Sherlock Holmes lived at 221B Baker Street. He did not live at 2221 Baker Street. So the LLM would give me the wrong answer if I was asking that question. So,
Yep.
just for future reference.
Thanks, John.
Aaron's got to update his website.
So I've got a better tool than the one that's on the website, because there's a big launch going out later this week that goes into more detail about that gateway. But I'll start off by setting the stage of things you guys already know, which you can see here. Gen AI is the most significant technology supercycle in human history. Big surprise, you guys already know that. In 2023, the global AI market size was valued at about 200 billion with a 37% CAGR. For the sake of what I'm talking about, when I say AI, I'm talking everything from analytics, machine learning, Gen AI. Like, I'm just using an umbrella term because the market tends to these days. The problem, though, is that while AI is an existential imperative for all businesses, our research conducted by our team at Berkeley, I don't know if Scott mentioned, but Opaque consists of a lot of researchers from Berkeley's RISE lab. I'll talk about that in a second. But here's the research that they've conducted combined with Opaque, which interviewed more than 500 enterprise leaders that range from C-level to SVPs of data AI. They are struggling to move their products, their AI projects, into production for the following three reasons. One, the regulatory and threat landscape's constantly changing, and huge concerns and fear, uncertainty, and doubt related to data privacy security. Next, the mechanisms by which companies are securing the data and ensuring data sovereignty, meaning that they retain the data ownership, is entirely manual, and everybody's using anonymization, which ensures one thing: they're leaking data, period. If you're anonymizing data, you're leaking data. The next and final key point that we've observed is, as a result of this, the end users don't trust AI with their data. And talking to, I don't know, 100 high-tech companies over the last couple of months, their users downstream are opting out of their new AI features, but they have to get their AI features into production to be competitive or be disrupted by up-and-comers. And the challenge is their end users don't trust their new AI features with their data. So it's become a pretty significant challenge. I'll tell you, the reality is that while the success of business is really inextricably bound to the success of their AI projects, less than half of enterprise data and AI projects are meeting expectations in terms of time and value. And then here's a real shocking stat. In 2023, that 200 billion estimated market size, about 3% of those AI projects went into production. 3% of 200 billion. So it's all related to data fears, privacy, security, sovereignty. I'm sure all of you guys are seeing this. Swami was just talking about it. So anyway, the background from Opaque, like, some of you guys may know me from my time in knowledge management, and then I went to ServiceNOW, and I was a general manager of a business unit there and helped them grow their customer service business unit before that. But the team at Opaque that I joined because I saw this as a problem at ServiceNow and in the market. There's this massive super cycle colliding with a cultural problem, which is nobody trusts each other, right? And it all stems from high-tech companies mining and refining personal data. And there's this collision with Gen AI that's going to make it worse. So the team at Opaque came out of this famous computer science lab at UC Berkeley called the RISE lab. It's where they invented Spark, which became Databricks. Some of the founders of Opaque are the founders of Databricks as well. Similarly, the next big project that spun out of there was Ray, which, if you do machine learning, you know Ray. It's a distributed compute platform for Python. Some of our founders are from Ray and Anyscale as well. And then Opaque's particular focus, though, which the research at Berkeley started 8 years ago. And their research was on how do you process data in a way that keeps it secure, private, and retains sovereignty. So they invented a new technology. They released it as an open source project and then spun out a company out of this lab. All of this is under one guy named Jan Stoika, who's the chairman of the board of all of these companies except for Opaque, although he's a founder of Opaque. And this team of researchers has been pioneering AI projects, including Opaque, and what they built was the ability to do confidential data because you can process encrypted data. So you can do analytics and AI on encrypted data sets. And the way that the technology works, and this is not going to be a sales pitch, by the way, but I just wanted to provide some basis for the conversation, is there's a confidential workspace and API. There's also a gateway. I'm going to get into LLMs is what I want to jump into because I'll have a broader discussion about LLMs. There's also the ability, because of this being a headless, you can extend your existing infrastructure. And then one of the many unique things about Opaque is this has a hardware root of trust. It's using a new kind of computing that now all of the chip manufacturers provide called confidential computing. In fact, we have a summit in June. There'll be a big focus on data and AI and creating trusted AI and confidential data. It's like a who's who there. Like we've got Anthropic, we've got Meta. You guys all should consider registering and attending. I will share a coupon code if anybody's interested, so you guys can get a discount to attend if you're interested. And it's June 5th and 6th. But anyway, what I'll do is I'll jump to the LLMs that was already being covered a second ago. So here's kind of the LLM model as it exists today. A user writes a prompt, right? That prompt then goes through some augmentation from data sources. You know, this is an oversimplification with a vector database. What I'm seeing inside the enterprise is multiple data sources. Some of them are vector, some are not. Some might be Databricks. You know, it varies. But the point is that this prompt augmentation with enterprise data that occurs includes company proprietary data, personally identifiable information about the customer. Like in this scenario, I'm a wealth management advisor. I'm assisting Tracy on tax advice. The augmentation takes Tracy's home address, her accounts, her gains, her losses, the proprietary playbooks we're running with her, and sends it to the LLM, which processes it and comes back with a response saying like, oh, harvest your tech stock losses last year and buy these ETFs that align with our investment playbook and your propensity to buy. You get the idea. You just leak data all over the place. And a lot of times what we're seeing too is people are training their own models. It doesn't have to be ChatGPT, Anthropic, et cetera. We're seeing a lot of people train their own models and still struggling with data leakage on the enterprise data side, but also on the tuning. I just spoke with a company 2 weeks ago that's a very prominent software security company that worked directly with the Gemini team at Google to train small language models with their customer data and launched an early access. Within a week, they had to kill the early access pilot because customers were able to tease out each other's data from the small language models training data. So huge problem. There is actually a solution to this, and I'm gonna show you how Opaque does it. But this is how I am. Accenture, we work with them quite a bit. Their CEO is a friend and brings us into projects. But there's other people who have done similar gateway. Ours is unique for a variety of reasons. I won't go into all of that, but I'll tell you, this is how you would implement it. Instead, what you do is you do the prompt, you do the augmentation. Opaque encrypts this because, and by the way, the user never knows that it's encrypted. So Opaque is unique in many ways. One of the ways I'll touch on is the data gets encrypted. And that means that as a user, I'm managing the encryption key, but it's invisible to me. Like I don't even know that I'm managing the encryption key. But now I just took a whole bunch of proprietary and confidential data and it's encrypted. Then it gets sent to an Opaque gateway. And within the Opaque gateway, we do monitoring and reporting for an admin. Just think of it as like a data firewall, like a network firewall. But there's a bunch of vendors that do stuff like this. Cloudflare just did an announcement about it yesterday. Ours is a bit different because it's encrypted end to end, including in memory. But the other thing that's different about ours is we use our platform and we run MML. Sorry, we run machine learning models to detect proprietary data to make recommendations about new filters. We also run a large language model in that gateway on the encrypted data that does prompt compression. So I've seen LLM implementations for internal companies cost $2 million a month. because the cost of tokens are soaring through the augmentation at the prompt level. So we can compress in the gateway. In our implementations, we're seeing 50% compression of the tokens, which dramatically saves on cost. But there's a bunch of open source libraries out there, like Microsoft Research put out, I think it was LLM Lingua, or I can't remember what it was. They modified Llama to do prompt compression effectively without sacrificing the quality of the response from the LLM. So I'm just giving you some ideas about things you might use if you're not looking at Opaque. And then the other thing we'll do is we use NLP inside the gateway, and we'll sanitize any PII. When we do the sanitization, we tokenize, and you'll see why in a second, because with LLM, we can get a great quality response back. And then when it returns to what we'll do is again encrypt it, and then oh, there we go. I was clicking the wrong button. We then de-anonymize it before sending it back to the customer. But the other thing, or the user, but the other thing that we do post-processing, which comes up a lot, is we'll do post-process cleanup the fine-tuning data. So we can take and sanitize any training data that and would be preventing customers from seeing each other's information. I'm going to go off video because it looks like my network's unstable.
Hey, Aaron, I got a
So
question
I'll
for you
pause
here.
to see if there's any questions here. I just keep, yeah, please
Yeah,
do.
I've got one, and then I'll pause again for the audience. So for solutions like this that are sort of that in the middle firewall, to use your analogy, what's the difference in, privacy of the data and to the organization utilizing that service in that sort of an approach versus downstream? So in other words, why should we trust that Opaque service there in the middle to do this instead of going ahead and sending it to the downstream systems? Because you guys are still getting the confidential information. Is that right? Or do you deploy it like at the customer where your service never sees it?
So great question. First, Opaque can't see the data because it's encrypted.
Okay.
So the user owns the encryption key, and the kind of the secret sauce of Opaque is we can still process the data without seeing the data, because there's some magic in the software stack where inside the die on the CPU, it's decrypted on the fly and processed, but nobody can see that because we don't have the encryption key, and the end user owns the encryption key. So first and foremost, let me explain. Opaque can't see it. Azure can't see it. Nobody can see it. If you tried to break into the CPU to look at the data, because it's encrypted in memory, so you can't see it there, you would destroy the data. So you would have to presumably find all of the CPUs that have the data and break into them, and they'd be destroyed.
Okay.
That
Excellent.
said, we don't have to host it. We host by default on Azure. We have some, we just did we just launched a project in Europe with a government agency with the European Union that's taking data from all of the EU member countries. They're not doing LLMs. They're not using the gateway. They're using our platform to do analytics and machine learning on all of the EU member countries' data to identify ransomware attack vectors. And then they have signals to alert the member countries of new attack vectors, and they're training machine learning models on how to identify and provide countermeasures. But here's the key point. It's all encrypted data. So each one of the member countries are putting their encrypted data inside the Opaque environment to enable this. It's not a gateway use case, but it's the same point as they cannot legally share their data across the EU member countries. But with Opaque, they can share it without showing it to each other. And they can then process it with analytics, machine learning, or even LLMs for that matter. Because that's actually the next phase of the project is they'll train LLMs with the data. They'll fine tune it on encrypted data. But where they deploy it, like within Europe, they deployed on their own hardware that Accenture manages for them in Europe in a data center somewhere. I don't know. I don't care, right? But suffice to say, the key point is Accenture can't see the data either,
Yeah,
nor
yeah.
could people in the data center.
Yeah, and that's
Great
why, so
question.
just as a disclaimer, Opaque is not a client of mine. Aaron and I have just known each other for a while, and I was aware Esteban had told me about that when he kind of briefed me on what you guys are doing. This is why I wanted you to be here. You know, regardless of the name of the solution, I found that to be a very interesting approach of, you know, privacy. But let me pause and see anybody else from the attendees list has any questions about that, because I think that's really key before we move on.
I'll say something that might stimulate some questions. This concept of a gateway, everybody's going to have to do this because you know what, the model layer, that's changing like every single week.
Yeah.
You know, every week, like what is the cost to run the model? What is the quality of the model? So you're going to want to build an intermediary layer that makes this hot swappable on the model side. Here's another thing that I'm seeing a lot of is I already talked about the training data coming back through the response that you can clean up at the gateway. I talked about cleaning up the prompt augmentation going to the LLM. But here's what I'm seeing a lot of also inside the large enterprise. When people are doing their LLM implementations, like RAG or whatever augmentation technique they're using, I'll give you an example of I mean, we were just at, well, I can't cite that example. An auto manufacturer that we know, they have a variety of different data sources that they're doing their augmentation from. And those data sources are user group and role dependent, but they can't re-architect the data layer for the enterprise data. It would cost tens of millions of dollars in years. So what they're doing is they're building a logic in a gateway. In this case, it happens to be Opaque because of confidential data, but it doesn't matter. Like there's going to be these requirements where I can't re-architect the data layer. So I'm going to need like a gateway layer for filtering, monitoring, reporting, standardization, but also to create custom logic. Like in this scenario I'm describing, the data comes from the multiple dealers of the cars who sit like the dealerships, and then the customer, and then also the manufacturer. And depending upon who the user is who's writing the prompt and receiving the response, the data that's augmented has to have permissions applied, but they can't do that at the data layer. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And just to go back to a question that, or I'm sorry, a topic that John Schmay had thrown out earlier, that I'll sort of link these two together. I always look at AI as the most basic explanation of trying to do in a computer what a human, you know, had previously done. And I really like your example here because it's similar to authoring knowledge to solve a case, right? Like somebody has a problem with their router or whatever. You need to know who they are, what the product is, that sort of thing. And as a KCS author, for example, you would understand what you should put in the knowledge base article to have enough context for people to understand it. But then you would, of course, not put in, you know, PII, like, you know, Tracy Garcia originally had this problem, you know, that sort of thing. It's very similar to calling up the, you know, person at the investment company and needing to give them a lot of context. So I've really liked what I've seen on this concept for everything from basic knowledge authoring, where you can perhaps, you know, send enough context to a system from like a variety of case data and that sort of thing that's of course going to be littered with information that you don't necessarily want to expose to the LLM, clear through to these use cases where, you know, if it works for financial services, it'll probably work for public knowledge, you know, at a software company. And so, you know, let me just pause again and see what questions other participants may have here.
Well, this is John. Since I asked the question, let me pull on it a little bit. I mean, maybe I don't quite understand how you tag or identify proprietary data, but from what you were just saying, kind of got at the heart of this thing, which is what's a way for a machine to assess, you're saying, you know, something that a human does. Well, human, you know, if you've got a case or knowledge object that's littered with this stuff, is there really any shot at using AI to identify things that are private. I think there are some things in here that we're talking about Opaque being able to handle, but I'm not sure, I'm visualizing something that's a little more sparse, or what do I say, dispersed around the content that a human being could make judgments about quickly, but that might not be in a format or a language that names are fine, or numbers, but do you follow what I'm visualizing? Like an author can tell at a glance what kind of information should not be provided for various reasons, but it may not just be a quantifiable piece of information like a number or an account or whatever. I'm not sure how far machines can go in assessing where there might be security, I don't say breaches, but challenges in the text stream with any form of automation. Maybe there
Like with a proprietary data is a good example. Like, how do you know that investment playbook XYZ or is proprietary data that you don't want to share? That's what you're referring to, right, John? That's a good example.
Yeah, the automation component is a part that seems like it shades off into all kinds of reasoning that's probably beyond the capability, at least at present, for an AI, any kind of these LLMs or opaques to automate. Maybe I'm just
Yeah,
thinking about it.
there's some techniques. For example, we can run ML in the gateway, and this is not just anything I'm saying. Like, keep in mind, like I'm not here to give an opaque sales pitch, right? I'm trying my best not to, but I'm just coming from that perspective. But you could train your ML model to process data flowing through your gateway to detect repeating patterns that might be proprietary data. And then with monitoring and reporting, you have admins who get notifications around specific terms or phrases or data sets that you might want to label. Like, oh, is this something that's proprietary? So there is a way to do with AI that you can train a system to identify patterns that would be potentially sensitive or proprietary data that then you want to resolve.
Yeah, no, that
But
seems like
I'll give,
it's semi-assisted, right? You're
yeah,
identifying areas but at the end of the day, someone has to make a judgment, but at least you're identifying where to place their attention.
exactly. And then like on the post-processing though, John, which maybe you already figured this one out, you probably did. Like on post-processing, let's say training data comes back out of the model. Well, you can run your training data in the gateway and then know what to look for to sanitize, kind of like a bit mask.
Yeah, so you
Now,
use
you
the
might
AI.
get some false positives. You might get some false positives where you're over sanitizing something, but that's better than some customer's data coming out.
Yeah, and you're training it to do it with information you've assessed. So, yeah.
Hey, Aaron, another
Like the
question
same,
that was,
yeah,
go ahead.
go for it. No,
Another
go,
question that
Scott.
was posted in the chat from Michael Gagnon was, can the gateway make an intelligent decision on which LLM to run the prompt? Kind of to your point around hot swappability. And I want to add something into that I saw a quote from the lead data scientist from Wells Fargo has said that this type of privacy enhancing technology will actually improve the accuracy and speed of AI models. So can you kind of speak not only to his question, but the comment around improving the accuracy by doing this?
And so we're seeing that a lot where there's gateway products that are acting as a switchboard, routing to an appropriate model based on the request. So I'm not divulging anything sensitive about ServiceNow, but that's exactly how they first went to market was, hey, we're going to train a small language model to be like exceptional at kind of IT related stuff because it's ServiceNow, and then backstop that small language model with a foundation model. In the case of ServiceNow, it's no secret, it's ChatGPT. All right, it's OpenAI's foundation model. So that's kind of the common strategy that people are using. Accenture, and I'll bring them up just because I'm very familiar with what they're doing. They have what they call an LLM switchboard that Opaque's embedded in. And that's how they think about it is you've got this switchboard that prompts flow through and responses flow through. And as prompts come through, you can manage and route appropriately on which model is most effective. So the answer to that is like, absolutely. And I think that if you're in the enterprise, you just highlighted another use case for why it's important that you have a gateway.
And Swami, what
and then
about
the Wells Fargo? Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
The Wells Fargo example, that sounds like a quote directly off the Opaque website, I think, and I know exactly who that fellow was, Volkmar.
Mhm.
I don't know the specific, like, I think that probably what they're talking about there is the ability to get your projects into production more quickly.
Yeah,
And
that makes
that's
sense.
applicable, that's applicable. I'm just going to jump to this slide. It's applicable for multiple reasons and not just on Gen AI. Like, let's say you're doing like a data analytics project. Well, at Wells Fargo, it took them 10 months to prep and sanitize the data before they could start writing logic to process it. So when they introduced Opaque, it's encrypted data. They started that week. They didn't have to prep and sanitize the data. And in the case of Wells Fargo, it was a straight up like data analytics and machine learning project or projects. They were doing like several of them. One was fraud detection, but the point being like, oh, well, we don't have to worry about violating PII or other sensitive data. Just encrypt it, and then nobody can see it, and then we can process it. So that's on the privacy enhancing technology side. And the same would be applicable for launching Gen AI though, right? Because if you're doing, this is what we're seeing is like, well, we did this pilot, we want to get it into production, but now we can't because the data sort, like we don't know exactly what's being injected in or augmented into that prompt from the enterprise sources. We have no control over it. We have no visibility. We just don't know. So instead it's like, okay, well, run it through a gateway. The data is encrypted. You can monitor, you can report, you can see what data is going through it. You can start small, monitor, and then set up content filtering and train the ML in the gateway to sanitize by training it, just like what John and I were talking about a second ago.
Awesome. And Swami, what are you seeing from your clients on these topics? I'm curious.
I think, I mean, if I can add on to the topic about the gateway there, right? I think there's a question of like doing switching. The one thing that maybe I'm getting a little too technical, right? But there is when you're thinking about generative AI and you're having a conversational bot, there's a whole conversation history that's going on, right? So you can't easily switch between different LLMs in the middle of a conversation, right? But you can certainly, as Aaron was saying, I mean, it might be a little bit more challenging to do that, right? Not that it cannot be done, but the types of responses you might get back from different LLMs could vary, and you really want to be sensitive to that, to kind of how you work with those, right?
That might feel like a real live agent scenario where they switched the agent on you and didn't tell you. Just joking.
Yeah. So those are definitely, but I think the idea of like starting with one LLM or using different LLMs for different specialized use cases, right? And keeping a conversation tight and focused on a topic, and then switching it over. Those kinds of things are definitely more options to evaluate. But with a lot of companies that we're working with, they're still pretty early on in their journey when it comes to generative AI, especially. They see the power of it, but they're also very unsure and trying to figure out like what use cases should we start with, right? And we're looking at it in terms of what are the use cases that make sense for them? What is the data that's available for them to work with it, right? When we're talking about very large enterprises, very large entities, data is typically not an issue. The quality of the data and the coverage that the data has, those tend to be more the issues. But as you start moving towards mid-market and smaller organizations, the amount of data they have often tends to be an issue as a starting point. But leveraging AI as a way to start collecting more data can oftentimes be an interesting way to build up your data and get you to a point where you can actually start now leveraging data in your and the AI capabilities that come with it, right? So that's one of the areas where we're often consulting with our customers on. And the other aspect is, I mean, the one thing that we absolutely have to be very careful with Gen AI is the fact that even when you have a human in the loop, where responses are coming back from Gen AI, an experienced human in the loop will really be able to understand what is being generated by the AI and whether it's accurate or not. The more inexperienced your users are, right, the less likely they are to catch problems with your Gen AI output, right? So that's the other area that when it comes to change management, when it comes to training people, when it comes to readiness, that's the other aspect that we're also paying a lot of attention to as we engage with customers.
Awesome. There's another question
You
about
just brought up before we take the question, I just want to add on to what Swami was saying is, as it pertains to collecting data as part of like an AI implementation, we could like pull on that rope a long ways. But one of the things that I wanted to highlight is one of the things that we've seen research on and we're seeing is LLMs are really, really good at predicting PII about people without their permission, just through asking, like just through general usage. So there's great research on this, like on Archive, where a team was able to get like 75% of a human being's PII just by standard use. Like it wasn't even maliciously trained. And then once you actually train it to be malicious to do data like that, they got it up much, much higher. So again, like this is an example of why you'd want a gateway in the middle, because you could actually prevent that kind of behavior at a model level. It's a fascinating use case. Just how easy it is for a large language model to tease out from standard conversation PII.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that leads right into the question that Jason asked about, teams, enterprise versions of OpenAI, et cetera. They all say the data is protected and that they don't use it to train their models. They say that it's anonymous and aggregate and that sort of thing. Can they be trusted or not? I mean, my personal opinion, right, is I use, going clear back many years, like different services that swear that my data will be protected, but before I send it to them, I encrypt it with an encryption key that I'm the only one that has access to, so that when the inevitable event occurs and they send me that email saying, oops, there was a data breach, I've at least got my backup plan there. But Aaron, Swami, what do you guys think about in general, the concept of trusting these providers? That's exactly why I asked Aaron that first question around why should we trust Opaque rather than downstream? And it was kind of a leading question because I was already aware of that from another friend that, the encryption relied on the client and was done at that hardware level type of thing. But what do you guys think about that?
I mean, one of the, as I mentioned, I mean, we're a partner with Salesforce, right? We implement Salesforce's technology, and with Einstein GPT and Copilot, this is oftentimes a topic that always comes up, right? And the way Salesforce and is working is that they even if they allow you to use OpenAI as a partner for the LLM. They have contractual configuration. I mean, both contractually and technically, they've set up their environment to be a zero trust environment, so that a lot of prompts and data that are generated from the Salesforce platform and sent over to OpenAI is processed by OpenAI in an environment where they don't save anything on their servers once the processing is done. And even with a lot of the, so you can set up contractual arrangements with these organizations so that they do not take your prompts, take your data, and save it anywhere, right? But I think when you take an approach like what OpenAI, what Opaque is doing, that I think elevates it to an even higher level, where there is complete separation of that whole the way information is being sent over, and only a sanitized version of it is sent over to the LLM engines, and then the response is brought back and stitched back up with the actual data that you provided.
Yeah, I agree with what Swami said. I'll add on that, like, if the companies that we're speaking with generally are suspicious of the large language models because nobody really knows what's going on inside them. Nobody
Yeah.
knows. And anybody who tells you that they do is being dishonest. Does that mean that you can't trust them? For companies that we're working with, generally, they have very significant concerns about that. That said, setting aside concerns about data security, privacy, sovereignty, which, by the way, sovereignty is the one that comes up the most in my experience, is retaining their data and making sure that they aren't leaking it to somebody else who can then use it. I'll add, just think about the pre and post processing too, though. Like, maybe that's not an issue for you, but you still will want to have a gateway because the cost and quality of the models are going to constantly be changing on a week-to-week basis. You might want to hot swap them. There's data that's flowing to those that are coming from your organization that you want to be collecting the exhaust from that data. And if you don't have a middleware layer or a gateway layer, you can't collect that exhaust and learn to do things like fine-tuning to improve models. Furthermore, you can't do pre and post processing, whether that's something trivial like anonymization or filtering, but there's like guardrails, sentiment analysis to do guardrails, or there's a variety of other things that there's so many reasons why your implementations in the enterprise require some kind of gateway.
Yeah, and Aaron, to that point you made around nobody knowing what's happening within the LLM, Bill Gates was interviewing Sam Altman and asking him about this, and Sam had an interesting response in that, you know, we're essentially, and again, oversimplified here, but we're somewhat trying to replicate the behavior that a human brain has. We're obviously never going to slice up somebody's brain and monitor how that works, but the positive of a computer-based technologies, we sort of can. But the point that I took out of that was twofold. One is, you know, we can monitor these things, but secondly, it's going to be a long time before we actually understand how the service even works. And so, same as how I encrypt my data before sending it to OneDrive, I might as well encrypt it before sending it to a company who has promised me to protect the information, but doesn't even really understand how the process works. So I might as well just encrypt it or mask it or whatnot. But I think we have time for one more question. Does anybody? Especially, I'd be very interested to hear. I don't say this to make anybody feel bad, but quite the opposite, to make, we're all in good company. I know many people on this call that have not deployed the technology for the very reason that Swami and Aaron mentioned, you know, because the organization is worried about the risk, which is exactly why I invited Swami and Aaron to come in here to give us some ideas about how to mitigate that risk, because typically reward doesn't come with at least some amount of risk.
If nobody has a question, I wanted to go back to maybe one of the question that was it Libby that had it at the start around what happens when I have knowledge content that's being when responses are being generated by an AI, and it doesn't look like I necessarily need to refer back to the knowledge articles that generated that particular response. I think what organizations have to look at is, what do you lose when you stop tracking that kind of information, right? Because when it comes to training your bots, making them better, training your people, because you're not going to stop training people, right? You still need people to understand what's going on, why the bot's doing what it's doing, right? I mean, that's not going to go away. So if you stop tracking that information, you lose the opportunity to continue to train both your bots and your people.
Yeah. And as an add-on to that, Libby, sorry, I totally forgot to circle back to that. When generative AI first started coming out, I had to remind a lot of people, let's say, of some issues that I experienced with my first job out of college, which was working for a large bank, JP Morgan Chase. And there were many occasions where we couldn't even publish anything on a website until a governmental agency approved that content. That doesn't work in a world of, oh, just pass the inquiry to generative AI. If it comes back 80% correct, go ahead and send it to the customer. So I think there's not only cases where you want to save that data for your own future use, but you want to save or even not ever display that data so that your loss isn't the loss of your SEC license or something like that. So maybe we'll cover that in a future webinar. But what really sparked me about these concepts is even financial services companies with those sorts of restrictions are able to get around the risk concern and start to deploy value. Well, thank you, Aaron and Swami, very much. Oh yeah, go ahead, Aaron.
The question about compliance, Opaque does this. I'm sure others might as well. I don't know anybody who does, but we create a complete audit of the data that was processed, how it was processed, with a hardware root of trust that's digitally signed by the chip manufacturer. So let's say that you're processing data that has PII or some GDPR, first party data, some issue with it. You can prove with this audit log signed by the chip manufacturer, Intel, AMD, NVIDIA, whatever you're using, that your data was kept private and you've retained sovereignty and it was secure. So there's, I know how we do it. I know that the only other solutions I've seen are manual compliance. But here's the other thing that's kind of striking is what I'm seeing coming new to this space, because I'm pretty new on data and AI coming out. I've always been in business applications, right? It's shocking how everybody is anonymizing data, which is a like unequivocal violation of GDPR. And at some point, the regulators are going to come with a hammer and start giving people the smackdown on how they're processing data that's been anonymized, because it is this is unequivocal. It's irrefutable. People are violating GDPR, CCPA during their data anonymization because it's impossible to sanitize the data entirely through anonymization. So I suspect similarly that applies to Gen AI, but it's an interesting question you bring up. Thanks for the question. John,
Well,
another familiar name, John.
Thank you very much, Aaron and Swami. As always, I'll post the recording for anybody who wasn't able to make it or anybody who wants to revisit this. And Aaron, Swami, is it okay if anybody has any follow-up questions, they can reach out to you directly?
Absolutely. I put my email in the chat. It's just aaron@opaque.co, not .com. Feel free to reach out to me directly. I also shared a white paper on securing Gen AI. Some of the founders of Opaque wrote it, but they're also professors at Berkeley, and it's just generic. It's like, here's all the techniques you can use. It should be useful. It's pretty technical, but it might be helpful to all of you. I hope that it is. Thank you all.
Awesome.
And again, my apologies.
And yeah, thank you, Aaron, and thank you, Scott, for hosting this session. Definitely very exciting to always have these conversations.
Yeah, and thank you, Aaron, for being able to make it despite those challenges. I really appreciate it. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Great to see everybody.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.